Napoleon, history's boldest empire. Introduction. Welcome to the Nap University. Tonight we gently explore the life of Napoleon Bonaparte, a story of remarkable rise and fall, told in a calm and soothing way. We'll journey from his early life on a quiet Mediterranean island, through his rise to power in revolutionary France, and across his bold military campaigns that reshaped Europe. We'll also touch on the reforms he introduced, his eventual fall from power, his exile, and his lasting legacy. Imagine the scenes unfolding, the Corsican breeze of his childhood, the footsteps of marching armies, the rustle of royal banners, and the quiet of a remote island at twilight. Now let us begin the story of Napoleon Bonaparte, a life that rose like the morning sun and set like the gentle dusk. Early life. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15, 1769, on the island of Corsica, a mountainous land in the Mediterranean. The year before his birth, Corsica had been transferred from Genoa to France, so Napoleon entered the world as a French subject, though his heritage was Corsican Italian. He was the second of 8 surviving children in the Bonaparte family. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer and minor noble, and his mother, Letizia Ramolino, was strong-willed and devoted. The family was of noble lineage but not wealthy. They lived modestly in the ancient town of Ajaccio, surrounded by olive groves and sea breezes. In Napoleon's earliest years, Letizia's firm hand guided him. She instilled discipline in her young son, who could be energetic and mischievous. Later in life, Napoleon would reflect on his mother's influence with deep appreciation. In his own gentle words, "The future destiny of the child is always the work of the mother." He believed that her care and strictness helped shape his fate. We can imagine young Napoleon as a boy, learning important lessons at his mother's side in their quiet family home, perhaps feeling the warm Corsican sun filtering through the window as he studied his books. When Napoleon was 9 years old, he left his island home to pursue an education in mainland France. In January 1779, the young boy travelled north to a school in Autun, a town in Burgundy, to learn the French language and customs. French was not his first language. He grew up speaking Corsican Italian, so he had to work hard to adjust. He eventually became fluent in French, but he always spoke with a slight Corsican accent. His classmates noticed him as different. He was smaller in stature than other boys, spoke French imperfectly, and came from a faraway island. Because of these differences, Napoleon endured teasing and bullying from some of the other children. In the face of taunts, the young Napoleon grew quiet and reserved. Away from home and often feeling like an outsider, he found refuge in learning. He spent long hours reading by himself, delving into books on history and geography. His teachers observed that Napoleon excelled at mathematics and showed a keen interest in history. One examiner even wrote that the boy has always been distinguished for his application in mathematics. He is fairly well acquainted with history and geography. This boy would make an excellent sailor. Though destiny had other plans than the navy, this early academic diligence hinted at Napoleon's sharp mind. We can picture him as a lonely teenager in the school at Brienne, perhaps sitting by a dim lamp at night, absorbed in tales of ancient generals and empires, dreaming quietly of future adventures. Napoleon's father died of illness when Napoleon was just a boy of 15. This loss forced Napoleon to grow up faster. The family's finances became tight, and as one of the older siblings, Napoleon felt a responsibility to support his mother and younger brothers and sisters. Despite the personal hardship, he pressed on with his education. In 1784, at age 15, Napoleon earned admission to the prestigious École Militaire military academy in Paris. He was the first Corsican ever to attend that elite academy. There, Napoleon trained as an artillery officer, immersing himself in the study of cannons, fortifications, and strategy. He completed the program in a single year, an impressive but challenging feat undertaken because of his family's strained finances after his father's passing. At 16, Napoleon graduated and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the French army. Thus, by the late 1780s, Napoleon was a very young officer, serious and highly trained, ready to serve. He had come a long way from the carefree days of childhood in Corsica. Though still a teenager, he carried himself with a focused, thoughtful air. He returned to his homeland for a time, taking an assignment in Corsica as a soldier, and he initially nursed youthful dreams of helping High Zisland gain greater autonomy. But history's tides were shifting, and Napoleon's path would soon entwine with the great events of France. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted, a tumultuous wave that would carry Napoleon to unexpected heights. As revolution broke out, Napoleon found himself pulled between his Corsican identity and his loyalty to France. In Corsica, some, like the local leader Pasquale Paoli, wanted independence from France. Napoleon's family initially had supported Paoli's cause years before, but Napoleon was now a French-trained officer with republican ideals. He chose to side with revolutionary France. In the early 1790s, young Bonaparte allied with the Jacobins, a radical revolutionary group, and opposed Paoli's separatists. This led to conflict and danger for the Bonaparte family in Corsica. In 1793, civil strife on the island forced Napoleon, then 23, and his family to flee their Corsican home for the safety of mainland France. The family home in Ajaccio was burned, and Napoleon became effectively an exile from his own birthplace. It was a difficult moment, but it also severed his ties with Corsican politics and fully committed him to France. By this point, Napoleon Bonaparte was a dedicated French revolutionary officer, ready to make his mark. The once lonely schoolboy had grown into a confident young man, determined to advance. He had withstood homesickness, bullying, and the loss of his father. He had absorbed the principles of the Enlightenment and Revolution. All these early life experiences, the discipline of his mother, the rigours of military school, the feelings of being an outsider striving to prove himself, formed the foundation of his character. From now on, Napoleon's fortunes would rise in tandem with those of revolutionary France. In the next gentle breaths of our story, we will see how opportunity and ambition carried him upward. Even from a quiet childhood in Corsica, a bold destiny was unfolding: rise to power. The 1790s were a time of great upheaval and chance, and Napoleon's rise to power began under the warm sun of southern France, on the artillery training grounds and battlefields of the Revolution. After rallying to the revolutionary cause, Napoleon quickly proved himself to be a resourceful and bold military officer. His first taste of real fame came in 1793 amid the Revolutionary Wars at the Siege of Toulon. Toulon was a port city in southern France that had rebelled against the Republic and welcomed British royalist forces. Napoleon, only 24 years old, was put in charge of the artillery batteries during the siege. With keen insight, he devised a plan to place cannons on a strategic hill, a move that allowed the French to bombard the enemy fleet in the harbour. The attack was a success. Toulon fell back into French hands and the foreign ships were forced to sail away. This victory was achieved swiftly, in part due to Napoleon's careful planning and courage under fire. Napoleon's role at Toulon did not go unnoticed. His brilliant handling of artillery and the victory he helped secure brought him to the attention of France's leaders. The young officer was promoted to the rank of Brigadier General, an extraordinary promotion for someone in his mid-20s. All of a sudden, Napoleon was a rising star. One powerful politician, Augustin Robespierre, the brother of the famous revolutionary Maximilien Robespierre, became his patron for a time. For Napoleon, the siege of Toulon was a turning point, the first stepping stone on the path to greatness. France in those days was in chaos and constant change. After Toulon, Napoleon experienced the turbulent politics of the revolution. He was briefly caught up in the dangerous shifts of power. When the Robespierres fell from grace in 1794, Napoleon was actually arrested for a short period due to his association with them. But this setback was temporary. Napoleon kept a low profile and was soon released, avoiding the fate that many others met under the guillotine. His skill was too valuable to ignore for long. By 1795, a new government called the Directory ruled France, and they needed capable commanders to protect the revolution from its enemies. Napoleon, ambitious and ready, was about to get another big opportunity. In October 1795, royalist crowds in Paris rose up against the revolutionary government. A large mob of armed insurgents threatened to storm the Tuileries Palace and overthrow the Directory. Napoleon was put in charge of the defenders in what became known as the 13 Vendémiaire incident, using the French revolutionary calendar date. Showing both resolve and ruthlessness, Napoleon positioned his cannons in the streets of Paris and, when the mob advanced, he ordered grape shot to be fired into the crowd. The grape shot, essentially a spray of small iron balls, devastated the attackers and quickly ended the uprising. Hundreds of rebels were killed or wounded in moments, and the remainder scattered in panic. The revolt was crushed almost instantly. This swift action saved the government and again showcased Napoleon's decisiveness. The leaders of France were immensely grateful. As a reward, the 26-year-old Napoleon was promoted to Major General, and soon after he was given command of the French Army of Italy. Imagine that for a moment. A relatively obscure young man, not long out of school, now in charge of an entire army. It was nearly unheard of, but such were the times when talent could catapult someone upward. Napoleon's rise to power was accelerating, like a bird catching a warm current of air and soaring higher. In March 1796, as he prepared to depart for his new command in Italy, Napoleon made a significant personal decision. He married Josephine de Beauharnais. Josephine was a charming Creole widow, 6 years older than Napoleon, with 2 children from her previous marriage. She was sophisticated and well-connected in Parisian society. Napoleon was deeply infatuated with her. Letters from this period reveal his ardent love. The civil wedding took place just weeks before he left to lead the Italian campaign. Josephine's grace and social savvy would later help Napoleon navigate high society, though their relationship was sometimes stormy. For now, Napoleon rode out at the head of the army of Italy, buoyed by personal happiness and professional zeal. Once in northern Italy, General Bonaparte transformed a demoralized, undersupplied French army into a formidable force. In a whirlwind campaign through 1796 and 1797, Napoleon displayed dazzling military skill. He moved his troops with speed and surprise, winning battle after battle against the Austrian Empire, which was one of France's main enemies. His strategy was often to divide his foes and strike quickly at one wing before the others could assist, a tactic requiring boldness and timing. At battles such as Lodi, Arcole and Rivoli, the French, inspired by Napoleon's leadership, defeated larger Austrian armies and their allies. The young general's charisma and confidence were so infectious that his soldiers nicknamed him Le Petit Caporal, the little corporal, as a term of affection, noting how he would personally direct cannon placement or lead charges, sharing the risks of the common soldier. By 1797, Napoleon had forced Austria to sue for peace. The resulting Treaty of Campo Formio was highly favourable to France, earning territorial gains and marking a triumph for the Republic. Napoleon returned to France as a national hero. His Italian campaign made headlines across Europe. Here was a man in his late 20s who had humbled the old powers of Austria on the battlefield and redrawn the map of northern Italy in France's favour. The French people adored him for these victories, seeing Napoleon as a brilliant liberator spreading revolutionary ideals. His soldiers were devoted to him, impressed by his ability to share their hardships and lead them to glory. Stories spread of Napoleon's personal courage, his keen intellect, and even his simple lifestyle on campaign. He often slept little and worked late into the night planning manoeuvres. In these peaceful moments of our story, we can appreciate how extraordinary this rise was. Not long before, Napoleon was a lonely student. Now he was a celebrated general shaping the fate of nations. His star was ascending rapidly, yet it would climb higher still. By 1798, Napoleon was eager for new challenges. The next target was not on the European continent but overseas, Egypt. At Napoleon's urging, the Directory agreed to an expedition to Egypt, which was then part of the Ottoman Empire. The goal was twofold: to threaten Britain's access to its colony in India by controlling the eastern Mediterranean, and to emulate the grand campaigns of ancient heroes by conquering the land of the pharaohs. Napoleon also brought along scientists and scholars to study Egyptian civilization, indicating his interest in knowledge and legacy. In the summer of 1798, he sailed across the Mediterranean with a large French force. Arriving in the heat of July, Napoleon's army marched through the desert sands and met the forces of the local rulers, the Mamluks, near the pyramids of Giza. In the Battle of the Pyramids, Napoleon used a novel square formation to fend off Mamluk cavalry. The battle was a decisive French victory. Legend has it that before the fight, to inspire his troops, Napoleon pointed to the pyramids and said, "Soldiers, from the heights of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." Whether or not those exact words were spoken, the sense of awe was real, a feeling of being part of history's grand sweep. After their victory, the French captured Cairo. For a brief moment, it seemed Napoleon might establish a new French domain in the east. However, fortune shifted with the winds on the Nile. Only days after the triumph on land, Napoleon's navy, which had transported his army, was virtually destroyed by the British Royal Navy. In August 1798, at the Battle of the Nile, British Admiral Horatio Nelson caught the French fleet at anchor and in a ferocious nighttime battle sank or captured most of their ships. Napoleon and his army were now stranded in Egypt as their means of return was gone. The ambitious general did not yet know defeat, and he pushed onward into the Middle East, marching into Syria in early 1799. But there he met with setbacks, notably a failed siege of the fortified port of Acre in present-day Israel, where stubborn defence and disease halted his advance. The expedition that had begun with such promise was turning difficult. With his troops weakened by plague and constant skirmishes, Napoleon eventually decided to abandon the campaign. In August 1799, Napoleon quietly slipped away from Egypt. Sensing that the political situation back home in France was dire and full of opportunity, he left his army, now under other generals' care, and with a small entourage sailed back to France. This decision might sound harsh to leave his soldiers behind, but Napoleon was confident he was needed in France and that he alone could salvage the nation's fortunes. He managed to evade the British blockade and arrived in France in October 1799 to a hero's welcome. The public, hearing mostly of his victories and not yet of the struggles, greeted him as the victorious general of the East. And indeed, events in France had reached a crisis. The government of the Directory was weak, corrupt and unpopular. France's wars in Europe were ongoing and chaotic. Many sensed that a strong leader was needed to restore stability. Napoleon, with his magnetic presence and record of success, seemed to be the answer. So, in November 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte took part in a bold political coup, an event that would mark the true start of his political power. This coup occurred on the 18th Brumaire of the year the 8th by the revolutionary calendar, which corresponds to November 9th, 1799. In a series of swift manoeuvres in Paris, Napoleon and his allies, including influential figures like Emmanuel Sieyès, overthrew the Directory government. Troops loyal to Napoleon occupied key points in the city. Amid confusion and some resistance in the legislature, Napoleon asserted control. Remarkably, the coup was nearly bloodless, achieved with hardly a shot fired. When the dust settled, the Directory was gone, and a new consulate was established with 3 consuls at the top of government. Napoleon was named first consul, the leading position, effectively making him the most powerful man in France at just 30 years old. After years of turmoil, France now found a clear, singular leader in Napoleon Bonaparte. He moved into the residence of the rulers, the Tuileries Palace, taking up the offices once inhabited by kings, though he was not yet a king himself. Outwardly, France remained a republic, but in reality, Napoleon was in charge, initiating what would become a period of strong personal rule. With calm determination, he began working to restore order to a society exhausted by a decade of revolution and war. Napoleon's first years in power were focused on consolidating France's situation, both internally and externally. He famously reassured the French people that the revolution's chaos was over by declaring, "The revolution is established on the principles with which it began. It is over." Now it was time to govern. But first there remained enemies abroad who doubted France's newfound stability. In 1800, Austria, encouraged by Britain and other allies in the Second Coalition, reignited war against France. Napoleon responded with characteristic energy. He led a French army across the snowy Alps in a daring mid-spring crossing, commemorated in paintings of him on a rearing horse, though the reality was he likely crossed on a mule in the slippery mountain passes. Surprising the Austrians in northern Italy, he faced them at the Battle of Marengo in June 1800. The battle was hard fought. For a while, things looked bad for Napoleon during the day. But he showed composure under pressure, and a timely French counterattack late in the afternoon routed the Austrian forces. Marengo was a victory, not just militarily but politically, as it solidified Napoleon's position as France's saviour once again. Elsewhere, French armies under other generals also triumphed, forcing Austria to make peace once more. By 1802, weary of conflict, even Britain signed a temporary peace with France. The Treaty of Amiens in 1802 brought a short-lived pause to the long years of war. At last, Europe was at peace, and Napoleon could turn his attention to healing and strengthening France internally. He was immensely popular among the French, who were grateful for the return of stability and victory. That year, a national referendum, plebiscite, was held, and Napoleon was made first consul for life, essentially confirming that he could rule indefinitely. Power was increasingly concentrated in his hands, though many French accepted this in exchange for stable governance. 2 years later, in 1804, Napoleon took the final step to cement his authority. He declared himself Emperor of the French. In a grand ceremony in December 1804, held in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, Napoleon's government orchestrated his coronation. In attendance was Pope Pius VI, brought from Rome to bless the new emperor. Famously, Napoleon crowned himself. He took the imperial crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head, as a symbol that he owed his throne to no one but himself. He then crowned his beloved Josephine as Empress. The cathedral, filled with dignitaries and bathed in candlelight, erupted in cheers of "Vive l'Empereur! Long live the Emperor!" Dressed in ornate robes, Napoleon cut a majestic figure, far removed from the young revolutionary in simple uniform he had once been. Yet observers noted that even in this moment of splendour, Napoleon maintained a calm, controlled demeanour, as if conscious of the weight of responsibility he was taking on. He was now Emperor Napoleon I of France. The French Revolution had come full circle, from a republic opposed to kings to a new empire under the leadership of a former revolutionary general. Napoleon's rise to power was now complete. In just a decade, he had climbed from an obscure artillery officer to the emperor of a vast nation. France, which had been fractured and adrift, was unified under his rule. The people had their hero, and Napoleon had his mission, to govern and to expand the influence of France. As we pause here, consider the arc we have followed. A young boy from Corsica with big dreams grew into a leader who would stand among the monarchs of Europe. It is a breathtaking ascent, one achieved through talent, ambition, and opportunity. In the soft quiet of this narrative, we remember how swiftly fate can move. Napoleon's story so far shows that with determination and vision, a person can rise from modest beginnings to great heights. Let's take a slow breath before we continue. Napoleon now sits at the pinnacle of power, but holding on to such power and expanding his empire will present new challenges. In the next part of our journey, we will calmly walk through Napoleon's bold military campaigns across Europe, seeing both his triumphs and the seeds of eventual hardship. Feel free to relax deeper as the story unfolds further, knowing we will revisit its important themes. Key military campaigns. Napoleon's rule as emperor ushered in a period of nearly continuous war across Europe, known as the Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815. Yet, despite the turmoil of battle, we will describe these events in a neutral and gentle manner, focusing on the broad movements and outcomes rather than violence or alarm. During these years, Napoleon's military genius and ambition were on full display as he built one of history's largest European empires. By the same token, the strain of constant warfare began to take its toll. The story of these campaigns is one of dazzling victories and also the first signs of hardship, like a bright summer that eventually gives way to autumn. After 1804, Napoleon's France found itself facing new coalitions of powers determined to contain his influence. The peace with Britain did not last. By 1805, Britain, Austria, Russia, and others had formed the Third Coalition against France. Napoleon, however, was prepared. He had assembled La Grande Armée, a grand army of highly disciplined troops, and devised bold plans to strike his foes. His initial intention was to invade England, France's old rival across the Channel. He massed forces on the French coast at Boulogne and built a flotilla of boats. But the British Royal Navy stood as an indomitable barrier. In October 1805, at the Battle of Trafalgar off the coast of Spain, the British fleet under Admiral Nelson decisively defeated the combined French and Spanish fleets. Nelson's brilliant tactics in the midst of roaring cannons ensured British control of the seas and ended any chance Napoleon had of crossing the water to England. Though Napoleon was not present at this naval battle, the news reached him and he quietly acknowledged that the sea was one realm where Britain reigned supreme. He would have to find victory on land instead, and victory on land he found. Turning his army eastward with characteristic speed, Napoleon marched into Central Europe to confront the Austrian and Russian armies. On December 2nd, 1805, a year to the day after his imperial coronation, he faced the Allied forces of Austria and Russia in what became his most celebrated triumph, the Battle of Austerlitz. The battle took place in Moravia, present-day Czechia, under a cold winter sun, and it is often called the Battle of the Three Emperors, as Napoleon, Tsar Alexander I of Russia and Emperor Francis II of Austria all oversaw their forces. Displaying masterful tactics, Napoleon deliberately weakened his right flank as bait, drawing in part of the Allied army, then struck decisively at the enemy centre and left. The result was a crushing victory. The coalition army was utterly defeated. Allied casualties were very high, while Napoleon's losses were relatively modest for such a significant battle. Soldiers who fought at Austerlitz never forgot the sight of the sun of Austerlitz breaking through the mist as the battle turned in France's favour, a moment Napoleon later invoked to inspire troops in other battles. In the aftermath, stunned by the defeat, Austria quickly made peace. The Treaty of Pressburg that followed forced Austria to give up territory and pay a large indemnity. More dramatically, the ancient Holy Roman Empire, a loose confederation of German states under Austrian leadership for centuries, was effectively dissolved. Napoleon reorganized many German states into a new confederation of the Rhine under his influence. In recognition of his achievements, Napoleon also took on new titles. For example, he became the King of Italy, having previously in 1805 crowned himself with the Iron Crown of Lombardy in Milan to rule over the Italian territories he had conquered. Europe was being reshaped at Napoleon's direction. By the end of 1805, Napoleon stood at the height of power, having defeated every army sent against him on the continent. In 1806, the momentum continued. Prussia, a proud military kingdom in northern Germany, felt threatened by Napoleon's reordering of Europe and decided to challenge him at forming the core of a fourth coalition with Russia and Britain. Napoleon moved swiftly into Prussian territory. On October 14, 1806, in twin battles at Jena and Auerstedt, his forces annihilated the Prussian armies. In a matter of weeks, Napoleon's troops marched into Berlin, the Prussian capital, where he famously visited the tomb of Frederick the Great, a respected former Prussian king and general, symbolically asserting that a new great commander had arrived. Continuing the campaign into the winter, Napoleon advanced into Poland to face the Russians. The conflict saw fierce fighting in the snow. Battles like Eylau in February 1807 were bloody and indecisive, fought in swirling blizzards. But by summer, Napoleon regained the advantage and won a major victory over the Russians at Friedland in June 1807. This compelled Tsar Alexander I of Russia to come to terms. In July 1807, Napoleon and Alexander famously met on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River to negotiate the treaties of Tilsit. They formed an alliance. Alexander agreed to join Napoleon's effort against Britain, and in return, Napoleon allowed Russia some influence in Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, Prussia was harshly punished, losing about half its territory, and forced to support the French alliance. At this juncture, around 1807 to 1808, Napoleon's empire dominated Europe. If one were to look at a map of the continent in 1808, you would see French control or influence stretching far and wide. France directly ruled modern Belgium and the Netherlands, much of Italy, and the Illyrian provinces, part of today's Croatia, Slovenia. Napoleon's brothers and marshals sat on various thrones. For instance, he made his brother Joseph the King of Naples and later King of Spain, and another brother, Louis, was installed as King of Holland. The Confederation of the Rhine made the German states west of the Elbe into virtual French client states. The Duchy of Warsaw was created in Poland under French protection, pleasing Polish nationalists. Austria, though humiliated, was temporarily at peace. Russia was, at least on paper, an ally after Tilsit. Great Britain alone, shielded by the sea, remained openly defiant and at war with Napoleon. Britain continued to fund resistance and use its navy to blockade French trade. In response, Napoleon imposed the Continental System, a sweeping economic embargo intended to close all European ports to British goods, hoping to cripple Britain's economy. For a time, it appeared Napoleon could do as he pleased in Europe. Yet, under the surface of these triumphs, problems brewed. One significant challenge emerged in Spain. In 1808, Napoleon made the fateful decision to intervene in Spanish affairs. He pressured the Spanish king to abdicate and placed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the throne of Spain. This move was intended to tighten the continental system and secure France's southwestern flank, but it backfired dramatically. The Spanish people resented foreign control, and a fierce popular uprising erupted. On May 2nd, 1808, the streets of Madrid convulsed with rebellion, immortalised in Francisco Goya's paintings. The French army faced a new kind of warfare here. Not set-piece battles, but guerrilla tactics, ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, and relentless resistance from ordinary Spaniards. The conflict in the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and neighbouring Portugal, which Britain aided, became known as the Peninsular War. Britain eagerly sent troops to help the Spanish and Portuguese. Soon the British Duke of Wellington was leading Allied forces against Napoleon's marshals in Spain. The war seesawed with many brutal incidents and no quick victory in sight. Napoleon himself went to Spain in late 1808 and won some battles. He entered Madrid and defeated Spanish armies, showing personal brilliance once more. But he could not be everywhere at once, and pressing matters forced him to leave the Iberian fighting largely to his subordinates. What he thought would be a quick intervention turned into a prolonged drain. One French marshal grimly nicknamed the conflict the Spanish Ulcer, bleeding France's strength for years. The tide began to turn in 1808 when Napoleon created this new front by usurping the Spanish throne, as it gave Britain a stronghold on the continent and encouraged resistance that Napoleon could not fully crush. The Peninsular War would drag on until 1814, sapping French resources and morale. It was the first sign that the empire was not invincible. Meanwhile, elsewhere, Napoleon continued to experience both peaks of success and growing challenges. In 1809, Austria, seeing Napoleon bogged down in Spain, dared to rise against France once more, starting the War of the Fifth Coalition. Napoleon responded with characteristic energy, rushing to the scene. That spring he fought the Austrians in a series of battles. In April, he was momentarily checked at Aspern-Essling near Vienna, the first significant battlefield setback of his career, where the Austrian Archduke Charles managed to inflict heavy losses and even killed Napoleon's close friend, Marshal Lannes. But Napoleon would not accept defeat. He regrouped and in July 1809 achieved a hard-fought victory over the Austrians at the Battle of Wagram. Wagram was a gruelling two-day battle with massive armies on both sides. While France prevailed, it came at a high cost in lives and did not feel as effortless as earlier victories. Austria sued for peace again with the Treaty of Schönbrunn, ceding territory to Napoleon's empire. Despite the toll, the win at Wagram solidified Napoleon's domination yet again. Now at the height of his power, Napoleon decided to make a profound change in his personal life to secure his empire's future. His marriage to Empress Josephine, though loving, had not produced any children, and Napoleon was keenly aware that he needed an heir. In 1809, shortly after defeating Austria, he made the painful decision to divorce Josephine. It was a heartbreaking moment for them both. Josephine wept bitterly, and Napoleon too was saddened, for he did care for her deeply. But he persuaded himself it was a necessity of state. He arranged to marry into one of Europe's oldest royal families. In 1810, Napoleon married Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria, the daughter of Emperor Francis II. This was a diplomatic union meant to secure peace with Austria and provide offspring. Marie-Louise was just 18, Napoleon was 40 by then, and though shy at first, she adapted to her role. Within a year, she bore Napoleon a son, Napoleon Francois Charles, in March 1811. The baby was given the grand title King of Rome from birth. Napoleon was overjoyed. He finally had an heir of his own blood, whom he affectionately called Napoleon VI, though the child would never actually rule France. It seemed as if Napoleon's dynasty and empire had been secured for the next generation. Imagine this moment: Napoleon at his palace in Paris, holding his infant son, feeling proud and content. The Emperor of the French was at zenith of his life, a vast empire at his feet. His family line continued, allied by marriage to an ancient dynasty, and respected or feared by all of Europe. By 1811, nearly all of continental Europe lay under Napoleon's influence. He had achieved a dominance few leaders in history ever had. From the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the steppes of Russia, from the North Sea down to the shores of the Mediterranean, Napoleon's policies, relatives, or troops held sway. If one stood at the centre of Paris at that time, one might feel that a new Roman Empire had been born with Napoleon as its Caesar. However, this bright day contained the seeds of a coming dusk. Continuous war had put strain on France's economy and population. Many young Frenchmen had been conscripted year after year to fill the ranks of the Grand Army. The conquered peoples, while initially overawed, were growing restless under heavy taxes and the enforcement of the continental system, which hurt their trade. Nationalist stirrings began to awake in Spain, in Germany, and in Italy, ironically inspired by the very ideas of liberty that the French Revolution and Napoleon had spread. And crucially, Napoleon's alliance with Russia was fraying. Tsar Alexander first disliked the continental system, which was damaging Russia's own economy, and he had personal reservations about Napoleon's power and perhaps envy or resentment toward him. By 1812, Russia had withdrawn from the trade embargo against Britain, signalling open defiance of Napoleon's strategy. Napoleon, seeing this as a betrayal and a threat to his system of control, decided to assemble an enormous army, the largest Europe had ever seen, to invade Russia and enforce his will. It was a decision that would lead to the turning point of his fortunes. Before we move on to the next section, let's gently recap the key campaigns we've covered, reinforcing them softly in our minds. Napoleon's early victories, Italy 1796-97, made him a hero. His Egyptian adventure, 1798-99, showed his ambition, though it had mixed results. The Battle of Marengo 1800 cemented his rule as first consul. Trafalgar, 1805, ended his hopes to beat Britain at sea, but Austerlitz, 1805, was a dazzling triumph on land. He defeated Prussia and Russia in 1806-07, Jena, Friedland, and redrew the map at Tilsit. By 1808, he was at his apex, but the intervention in Spain started a troublesome guerrilla war. Wagram, 1809, was a hard-fought victory against Austria, after which he made a dynastic marriage and finally got a son. Napoleon's empire reached its greatest extent by 1811, but under the surface, opposition and fatigue were growing. Each of these points marked a step in Napoleon's journey, rising, and then the first hints of decline. We shared them quietly to set the scene for what comes next. Now, in a relaxed breath, we will transition to discuss Napoleon's domestic policies and reforms, which he undertook even as these military events were unfolding. It's important to know that Napoleon was not only a conqueror, but also a lawgiver and organizer who changed France and many other lands in lasting ways. So let us turn calmly and with interest to the reforms of Napoleon's era, keeping in mind the grand tapestry of his story we've seen so far. Reforms. While Napoleon is often remembered for his battles and conquests, he was equally a statesman and reformer. He once said, in his characteristically confident way, "I intend to found a system durable for the future." Indeed, many of Napoleon's reforms endured long after the cannons fell silent. During his time as first consul and emperor, he reshaped France's laws, government, education, and more. These changes brought stability to a nation that had been torn by revolution, and they left a legacy that can still be felt today. In this section, we will gently explore these reforms, appreciating how they improved daily life and governance, all in a soothing and straightforward manner. One of Napoleon's top priorities on gaining power was to restore stability to post-revolutionary France. The 1789 revolution had swept away the old systems of monarchy and feudal privilege, but in the process, it had created chaos, multiple constitutions, shifting laws, economic turmoil, and deep social conflict. By 1799, people longed for order. Napoleon addressed this by centralizing the government and making administration more efficient. France was divided into departments, an idea from the Revolution, but Napoleon strengthened the role of prefects, officials he appointed to run each department. These prefects reported directly to Paris, ensuring that Napoleon's policies were implemented uniformly across the country. In the same spirit, he streamlined tax collection and public finance. In 1800, he established the Bank of France, which helped stabilize the currency and extend credit, reviving the economy. Through such measures, he cut through the confusion and gave France a strong, centralized state. People felt the difference. Roads were improved, food supply was secured, and trade revived under a more predictable system. One of Napoleon's most enduring achievements was the creation of a comprehensive set of laws known as the Napoleonic Code, or Civil Code. Before this, French laws had been a patchwork of local customs, feudal rules, and revolutionary decrees. Napoleon gathered the best legal minds to draft a unified civil law code that was clear, accessible, and based on principles of the Revolution, notably equality before the law, secular authority, and protection of property rights. The Napoleonic Code was promulgated in 1804. It abolished the remnants of feudalism in France, establishing that all male citizens were equal under the law, with no special privileges for nobles or clergy. It safeguarded the right to own property and the freedom of religion, though Catholicism was acknowledged as the faith of most French. The code also reformed family laws. For example, it made divorce legal but with some restrictions, and it placed the father as the head of the household. This legal framework was revolutionary in its clarity and fairness compared to what came before. It was written in straightforward language so that ordinary people could understand their rights and obligations. The Napoleonic Code was so influential that it served as a model for civil law codes in many other countries in Europe and beyond. In fact, elements of it persist in the laws of places from Belgium and Italy to the province of Quebec and the nation of Turkey in later eras. Napoleon himself considered the code one of his greatest achievements, saying that while his armies would be forgotten, the Napoleonic Code would endure. As we discuss this in our calm narrative, we recognize how this contribution quietly shapes daily life even centuries later. For example, the notion that the law should treat everyone equally owes much to this era. In addition to the civil code, Napoleon's government produced other codes, a code of civil procedure, commercial code, penal, criminal code, etc., all aiming to modernize and standardize how justice was administered. This eliminated confusion and ensured that in court a person would receive similar treatment whether they were in Paris or Provence. The code, however, reflected the attitudes of its time. For instance, it placed women in a subordinate position in many respects. Wives had fewer rights than husbands, for example. Despite its imperfections, the Napoleonic Code's core idea of a unified legal system was a progressive leap forward. Education was another area of reform. Napoleon understood that lasting stability required educating the next generation of citizens and officials. He famously said, "Of all our institutions, public education is the most important." The revolutionary period had experimented with education, but Napoleon made it more systematic. He established state secondary schools called lycées in 1801. These lycées were designed to train future civil servants, military officers, and professionals, essentially grooming talent for his government and army. Admission was based on merit, though mainly open to boys from families that could support them through school, including the newly emerged middle class and the sons of soldiers. The curriculum emphasized practical subjects like mathematics, science, and modern languages, along with history and the classical studies of Latin, reflecting Napoleon's belief in useful knowledge and discipline. Students in lycées wore uniforms and lived under a strict regimen, almost like a military academy. By 1814, some 36 lycées were educating about 9,000 students across France. For higher education, Napoleon created specialized schools, the grandes écoles, such as the École Polytechnique, founded earlier but supported by him, for engineering and military science, and the University of France, which was not a single campus but an imperial university system overseeing education standards. These institutions helped France produce skilled engineers, officers, administrators, and scientists. Even as cannons roared on the frontiers, classrooms in France were calmly shaping minds, a testament to Napoleon's forward-looking governance. Napoleon also paid attention to the economy and infrastructure. He reformed the tax system to make it more equitable and efficient so that taxes were collected regularly and the state's income became steady. He invested in building roads, bridges and canals to improve transport, some of which are still in use. Paris itself was beautified and modernised. He commissioned the construction of the Arc de Triomphe, though it was completed after his reign, to honour his grand army, improved the water supply and started organising street numbering. The aim was a France that was prosperous and well-run, matching the glory of its military victories. The church and religion presented a delicate issue. The revolution had attacked the Catholic Church harshly, closing monasteries, seizing church lands and attempting to establish a new state, religion or cult of reason. By the late 1790s, many devout Catholics in France were alienated. Napoleon, though a man of the Enlightenment and not particularly religious himself, saw the importance of reconciliation. In 1801, he negotiated an agreement with Pope Pius VII, known as the Concordat of 1801. This Concordat re-established relations with the Catholic Church in France on new terms. Catholicism was recognised as the religion of the great majority of French citizens, not the official state religion, but acknowledged and respected, and public worship was allowed again. The Pope, in turn, accepted the loss of church lands from the revolution and the authority of Napoleon to nominate bishops. The clergy would be paid by the state, essentially becoming civil servants loyal to France. With this agreement, religious peace returned. Churches reopened, ringing their bells once more on Sundays, and many French people felt a sense of normalcy and comfort restored in their spiritual lives. At the same time, the Concordat affirmed religious tolerance. Protestants and Jews in France were also given legal equality and allowed to organise their worship. Napoleon had skillfully healed a rift in French society, calming the conflicts over faith that had raged. He later said that making peace with the church cost him nothing but ink, implying it was a simple yet wise solution. This settlement lasted beyond Napoleon's rule and helped ensure that the principle of secular government with freedom of religion became a French hallmark. Napoleon's France also encouraged the arts and sciences. He patronised scientists, some accompanied him to Egypt and brought back great discoveries like the Rosetta Stone. The metric system of weights and measures, introduced during the Revolution, was firmly implemented under his reign, which improved trade and daily life by standardising measurements. Culturally, Napoleon's rule saw the rise of neoclassical art and architecture. Painters like Jacques-Louis David depicted Napoleon's era in grand style, for example, the famous painting of Napoleon's coronation. While these might not be reforms in the legal sense, they show his influence on the intellectual and cultural life of the nation. He wanted Paris to rival ancient Rome and modern London in grandeur, and he took steps toward that vision in a measured, deliberate way. It's important to note that many of Napoleon's reforms were not purely his own invention. Often they built upon changes started in the Revolution or ideas already discussed. But his strength was in implementation. He had a remarkable ability to cut through debate and enforce a practical system that worked. He was known for his prodigious work ethic. As ruler, he would wake early, dictate letters and laws to multiple secretaries in succession, and attend to the minutiae of administration even while on military campaigns. This intense focus meant that things got done. Where previous revolutionary governments had failed to stabilise currency or reconcile with the church or establish lasting schools, Napoleon succeeded, all while maintaining a sense of calm authority. The benefits of these reforms were felt by ordinary people. A farmer in Normandy might not know the details of the Napoleonic Code, but he would find that property transactions were easier and more secure than before. A young talented boy from a modest family might find his way to a lycée and rise by merit to become an officer or official, a path that was opened by Napoleon's meritocratic system. Indeed, Napoleon promoted many commoners to high ranks, saying, "Careers open to talent is the ideal." A devout Catholic grandmother in Lyon might quietly rejoice that she could attend Mass again without fear, thanks to the Concordat. The average citizen no longer had to fear sudden changes in law or violent swings in policy. Life under Napoleon, especially in the first decade of the 1800s, became more predictable and orderly. However, not everyone was content. The Napoleonic regime, for all its efficiency, was also authoritarian. Napoleon concentrated power in himself and tolerated little dissent. He censored the press. Newspapers were reduced in number and closely watched so that they mostly printed news favourable to the regime. Political opposition, especially any royalist plots or extreme republican schemes, was suppressed by a sophisticated police network run by Joseph Fouché, Napoleon's Minister of Police. Personal freedoms like freedom of speech or assembly were curtailed in the name of stability. Some people who had enjoyed the more freewheeling days of the revolution felt stifled. But many others accepted or even welcomed the stricter rule, reasoning that it was a small price to pay for peace and prosperity after the chaos of the 1790s. In our gentle retelling, we acknowledge this aspect without judgment. Napoleon's governance was a mix of enlightenment and control, bringing calm but also requiring submission to his firm leadership. Beyond France's borders, wherever Napoleon's armies went, they often carried these reforms. In the Rhineland, Western Germany, in Italy, in Poland, the old feudal orders were dismantled, modern administration introduced, and the Napoleonic Code, or variants of it, implemented. Many societies benefited from the end of serfdom and aristocratic privilege. For instance, in many German states, peasants were freed from serfdom under French occupation, and ghetto restrictions on Jewish communities were lifted. While foreign occupation was resented, some forward-looking people in those regions appreciated the progressive changes that Napoleon's system brought, seeds that would sprout later into demands for reform across Europe. In summary, Napoleon's reforms gave France a strong foundation. He famously said that his legacy would be the code, the laws, the administrative system he left behind, rather than his ephemeral military glory. We have seen how he reformed laws, Napoleonic Code, education, lycées and more, the economy, Bank of France, fair taxes, religion, Concordat, and government, centralisation and meritocracy. These achievements transformed France from the revolutionary experiment it was in 1799 into a modern state by the time his rule ended. In our tranquil reflection, we can appreciate how Napoleon the ruler improved the everyday workings of society, making things more rational, fairer in many ways, and efficient. This was the constructive side of his genius, often overshadowed by cannons and battles in history books. But as we drift in the calm waters of this story, the constructive side is clear and reassuring. Laws and institutions can sometimes outlast the turmoil of politics, providing continuity and justice. Let's gently reinforce a few key points about Napoleon's reforms in a brief list. For clarity, Napoleonic Code, 1804, a unified civil law code ensuring equality before the law and property rights, which still influences many legal systems. Concordat of 1801, an agreement with the Pope that restored the Catholic Church in France and allowed freedom of worship, healing social divisions. Educational reforms, establishment of secondary schools and higher institutes to train talented youth, emphasising merit and creating skilled officials and officers. Centralised administration, a strong, efficient government with prefects in each region and stable finances. Bank of France, reformed tax system providing order and growth. Infrastructure and economy, investment in roads, bridges and support for industry and trade under a stable currency and consistent laws. Meritocracy, promotion of individuals based on talent and accomplishment rather than noble birth, exemplified by new nobility titles given to those who served well and careers open to the capable. Each of these was like a gentle stroke in the painting of a better society, adding coherence and stability to France. Napoleon's France became a place where a person could plan for the future without the ground shifting under their feet every year. a place where a farmer knew what taxes to expect, a merchant knew the laws that would govern his contracts, and a student could dream of rising high through study and service. Having considered these reforms in a relaxed, thoughtful way, we have a fuller picture of Napoleon. Not just a general on horseback, but a lawgiver with a quill pen working late into the evening by lamplight to draft decrees that still echo today. His legacy is as much in his civil achievements as in his military ones. As we progress in our story, keep these positive accomplishments in mind, because they will be part of what remains after Napoleon's empire crumbles. They are like sturdy bricks that survived the collapse of a building. Now, with France's internal structure solidified under Napoleon's guiding hand, we return to the flow of events. We have seen Napoleon reach the pinnacle of power and shape his nation, but the world outside was growing resistant. In the next section, we will see how the fortunes of war turned against Napoleon, how his fall unfolded. We will tread through this part slowly and softly, as it involves hardship and loss. Remember, even as fortunes reverse, our narration stays calm and even, like a quiet observer of the tide going out after it came in so strongly. Take a deep breath and let us continue. Fall by 1812, Napoleon had reached unrivaled heights, but as the old saying goes, what rises must eventually fall. In this section, we will trace Napoleon's gentle downward arc, the series of events that led to the collapse of his empire. We will do so with a serene tone, recognizing the sadness and inevitability in this phase of the story without dramatic alarm. It is as if we are watching the sunset of a very bright day, the sky slowly changing colours. Napoleon's fall reminds us that even the mightiest leaders are mortal and that fortune can be fickle. The first major step in Napoleon's downfall was his ill-fated invasion of Russia in 1812. Relations between Napoleon and his former ally, Tsar Alexander I, had deteriorated over issues like the continental system and mutual distrust. Napoleon, determined to enforce his will, assembled an enormous army drawn from all corners of his empire: French veterans, Dutch and German conscripts, Italian and Polish allies, even some reluctant Prussian and Austrian contingents forced by treaty to assist. This grand army that marched into Russia in June 1812 numbered over 500,000 soldiers. By far one of the largest forces ever seen in Europe. Many observers were in awe as this host moved eastward, a seeming juggernaut. People thought no power on earth could withstand such a force. Yet, as the army advanced into the vastness of Russia, the campaign did not go as Napoleon expected. The Russian strategy under Marshal Kutuzov and with the Tsar's approval was to refuse a decisive battle. The Russian troops kept retreating deeper into their own country, drawing the French further in. As they retreated, the Russians adopted a scorched earth policy. They burned crops, barns and villages, leaving little food or shelter for the invaders. The summer heat was intense and already French supply lines were stretched. Still, Napoleon pushed on, eager to force a victory. A ferocious but indecisive battle finally occurred at Borodino near Moscow in early September 1812. It was a bloody clash. Casualties were extremely high on both sides, but there was no clear knockout blow. The Russian army retreated further after Borodino, and Napoleon was able to march into Moscow a week later. He expected to take winter quarters there and perhaps force the Tsar to negotiate peace now that the famous old capital was in French hands. But Moscow did not bring the relief Napoleon sought. The city was nearly empty. Most civilians had evacuated. Soon after the French arrived, fires broke out all over Moscow, likely set by the Russians to deny the city's resources to the enemy. Large parts of Moscow burned uncontrollably for days. Napoleon waited in the Kremlin, the old fortress in the heart of Moscow, for a month, but no peace offer came from the Tsar. Alexander I, sternly resolved, refused to even communicate. Meanwhile, the autumn chill set in, and Napoleon realized the terrible position he was in. Deep inside Russia, with a dwindling, exhausted army and winter approaching. Reluctantly, in October 1812, Napoleon gave the order to retreat from Moscow. The retreat from Russia became one of the most harrowing ordeals in military history. As the French army withdrew along the same route it had come, the Russian winter struck with full force, biting cold, snow and freezing winds. The soldiers, many without proper winter clothing, suffered immensely. Starvation set in, as the land had been scorched and what little remained was quickly consumed. Horses died by the thousands, depriving the army of transport and cavalry. On top of these natural woes, Russian partisan fighters and regular troops constantly harassed the retreating columns. Bands of Cossacks, swift Russian cavalry, would swoop in to attack stragglers or isolated units, then vanish. The once grand army steadily disintegrated. Men collapsed from hunger and cold, wagons were abandoned, discipline broke down. Napoleon himself rode in a sleigh part of the way, grimly witnessing the destruction of the force he had built. By the time the remnants of the Grand Army staggered back to the relative safety of Poland and Prussia in December 1812, the toll was almost unbelievable. Of the over 500,000 who had marched in, only perhaps 100,000 made it out in any kind of fighting condition. Hundreds of thousands were dead or captured. This catastrophic loss shook the foundations of Napoleon's empire. For the first time, Napoleon's aura of invincibility was shattered. Across Europe, former subjects and enemies alike realized that the giant had been wounded and could be beaten. Napoleon hurried back to Paris ahead of his returning troops, concerned about political fallout and to raise new forces. In a display of resolve, he managed to scrape together fresh armies in early 1813, drawing on younger conscripts and remaining reserves. But the magic was gone. The coalition of enemies sensed their moment. Prussia, which had been forced into uneasy alliance after 1807, now openly turned against Napoleon as soon as news of the Russian disaster arrived. In 1813, a sixth coalition formed consisting of Russia, Prussia, Britain, Sweden, and eventually Austria, which waited until summer to join when it saw Napoleon struggle. The year 1813 saw intense fighting in Germany as Napoleon, with a partially rebuilt army, tried to defend his dominance. Even diminished, Napoleon won some remarkable battles that spring. For instance, he defeated the combined Russo-Prussian forces at Lutzen and Bautzen in May 1813. However, he lacked his veteran cavalry and many of his skilled officers, lost in Russia, so he could not exploit these victories decisively. There were simply too many enemies converging from different directions, and his new troops were brave but inexperienced. By October 1813, the Allied armies, Russian, Prussian, Austrian, Swedish, and other German troops, managed to surround Napoleon near Leipzig in Saxony. There, over several days, the massive Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of the Nations, was fought. It was the largest battle in Europe prior to the World Wars, with perhaps 500,000 men involved in total. Despite a valiant defence, Napoleon was overwhelmed and forced to retreat after suffering huge losses. Many of his allied German states switched sides during or after this battle, further weakening him. After Leipzig, the writing was on the wall. Napoleon's forces were in full retreat back to France. The Allies invaded France itself in early 1814, yet Napoleon did not give up. In the opening months of 1814, he fought a brilliant defensive campaign on French soil, moving rapidly along interior lines, winning several small battles, often called the Campaign of the 6 Days, and trying to divide his enemies. His leadership in these last battles was later admired by military historians as some of his most skillful. He was fighting desperately to save his throne, like a candle flaring brightly before extinguishing. But the numbers were against him. By late March 1814, Paris was captured by the Allied armies. Paris, which had not seen foreign troops in generations, capitulated after a short resistance. With the capital lost, Napoleon's marshals and ministers implored him to see reason. They were exhausted. France was exhausted. On April 6, 1814, at his palace of Fontainebleau, Napoleon abdicated his throne for the first time. He accepted terms from the Allies. Under the Treaty of Fontainebleau, he would give up all claims to the French throne, and in return he was allowed a small personal empire to rule in exile. The Allies, trying to be magnanimous in victory, granted Napoleon the sovereignty of the tiny island of Elba, off the coast of Italy in the Mediterranean. They even allowed him to keep the title of Emperor, but now only Emperor of Elba, a domain of merely a few square miles. This arrangement was intended to remove Napoleon from the scene without humiliating him so much that he'd cause further trouble. They likely thought Elba was remote and insignificant enough. Napoleon, recognizing he had no better options at that moment, agreed. In a poignant farewell, he stood in the courtyard of his troops at Fontainebleau and said goodbye to his loyal imperial guard, some of whom openly wept. He told them, "Adieu, mes enfants. Farewell, my children," and that he hoped to meet them again in happier times. Then he was escorted out of France by Allied officers to begin his exile. So in April 1814, Napoleon went into exile on Elba. He was 44 years old. It must have been a jarring change, from commanding millions of subjects and vast armies to ruling a tiny island of fishermen and vineyards. On Elba, however, Napoleon did not succumb to despair. True to his energetic nature, he set about improving Elba, organising its government, building roads, and even amusing himself drilling a small personal guard of about 1,000 men he was allowed to keep. Meanwhile, back in France, the Bourbon King Louis the Yacht, the brother of the guillotined King Louis XVI, was restored to the throne by the Allies. Many in France were tired of war and accepted the old king's return if it meant peace. But others, especially soldiers of the Grand Army and Bonapartist loyalists, were sullen and dissatisfied. They had followed Napoleon to great glory and now saw a Bourbon undoing some of the revolution and Napoleonic achievements. For instance, Louis XIII's regime tried to restore properties to ex-nobles and bring back symbols of the old regime, though he did keep the Napoleonic Code and many reforms in place. There was still quiet, widespread respect for Napoleon among the rank and file and ordinary citizens who recalled the victories and stability he had provided. Napoleon spent only 10 months on Elba. The flame of his ambition had not fully gone out. In early 1815, he learned that the Congress of Vienna, the meeting of allies to reorder Europe, was having disagreements, and that the situation in France under Louis XIII was not entirely steady. There were economic problems, and the king was not particularly popular with the army. Seizing the moment, Napoleon daringly escaped Elba on February 26, 1815. With a handful of followers, he sailed back to the south of France, landing on March 1st near Cannes. From there he began a dramatic march north toward Paris in what is called the 100 Days, because it lasted about 100 days from March to June 1815. As Napoleon travelled through France, soldiers sent by the king to arrest him instead rallied to his side. Famously, at one encounter, Napoleon stepped off a horse, opened his coat and addressed the royal troops. "Here I am. Kill your emperor if you wish." Instead of firing, they cheered, "Vive l'Empereur," and joined him. His legend and charisma were still powerful. Townspeople and peasants also flocked to see the spectacle. King Louis XVIII fled Paris when he heard Napoleon was coming. On March 20, 1815, Napoleon entered Paris to the joy of the crowds. He was once again the ruler of France, without a shot having been fired in anger on his way. A truly astonishing comeback that shows how, in the hearts of many French, Napoleon was still their leader. This period is often just called the 100 Days or Napoleon's second reign. Napoleon promised peace and a liberal constitution upon his return, trying to win over those wary of renewed war. However, the Allied powers, upon hearing of his escape, were determined to remove him once and for all. They declared Napoleon an outlaw and immediately began mobilizing armies to put him down. Napoleon knew he had limited time before the coalition forces massed. He rapidly raised an army, including many veterans eager to fight for him again, and decided to strike first before the Allies could unite fully. His plan was to attack the Allied forces in Belgium, where British and Prussian armies were gathering, and defeat them separately. In June 1815, Napoleon moved into modern-day Belgium. This leads us to Napoleon's final campaign and the famous Battle of Waterloo. On June 16, 1815, he met the Prussian army under General Blücher at Ligny and defeated it, forcing the Prussians to retreat, though they were not crushed. The same day, one of his marshals, Ney, fought a British holding force at Quatre Bras. 2 days later, on June 18, 1815, Napoleon faced the British-led Allied army of the Duke of Wellington near the village of Waterloo, south of Brussels. A dramatic and fiercely fought battle raged all day amid rain-soaked fields. Napoleon launched numerous assaults on the British lines, which held firm on a ridge. In the late afternoon, the Prussian army, having regrouped, arrived on the field to reinforce the British. With fresh troops attacking his right flank, Napoleon's forces began to waver. In one last effort, he sent his elite Imperial Guard forward. The sight of these renowned troops was meant to turn the tide. But for the first time, the Guard was repulsed and broke. Panic spread in the French ranks as Allied troops counterattacked. By evening, the French army was en route. Waterloo was a crushing defeat. Wellington and Blücher met and congratulated each other on the victory. The name Waterloo has since become synonymous with ultimate downfall. For Napoleon, it was the end of the road. Within days, Allied forces closed in on Paris once more. Napoleon hastened back and found that political support for him had evaporated after the defeat. Realizing that the situation was hopeless, he abdicated again on June 22, 1815, this time without conditions. He originally hoped to escape to the United States, but the British Navy made that impossible. Finally, on July 15, 1815, Napoleon surrendered himself to the British, who were his implacable foes, but in whose honour he perhaps trusted more than that of the Prussians or Russians. He was taken into British custody. The Allies, not willing to risk any further Napoleonic return, decided to send him to a far-off location where he could have no hope of escape or influence. They chose the remote island of St. Helena, a small speck in the South Atlantic Ocean, thousands of miles from Europe, off the coast of Africa. In October 1815, Napoleon was transported to St. Helena aboard a British warship. This forlorn, windswept island would be his final home. So ends the story of Napoleon's fall. He went from commanding Europe to imprisonment on a distant island. It is a melancholic turn of fortune, one that might evoke a sigh, but we recount it here as a gentle reminder of the impermanence of power. Napoleon's meteoric career had reached its final chapter. He was still only 46 years old when he arrived at St. Helena, but the remaining years would be spent in confinement, albeit a comfortable one by prisoner standards, in a house called Longwood on the island. We should note the events on St. Helena briefly, as they conclude Napoleon's personal story. On St. Helena, Napoleon was under the watch of the British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, who kept a strict eye to prevent any escape. Napoleon occupied his time by dictating his memoirs, reflecting on his life, and often trying to justify his actions in the grand story of history. He walked in the gardens, gazing at the Atlantic horizon, no doubt often lost in memories. His health began to fail in the damp climate. Eventually, on May 5th, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died on St. Helena, likely from stomach cancer, the same ailment that may have killed his father. He was 51 years old. His last words, witnesses said, were something like, "France, the army, Josephine," as if his mind in final moments wandered to what he loved most. He was buried on the island in a shaded valley. Napoleon had expressed a wish to be buried on the banks of the Seine in Paris, among the French people I have loved so much, but the British authorities interred him in St. Helena, as per protocol. Years later, in 1840, the French did bring his remains back to Paris to lie in honour at Les Invalides, granting his final wish posthumously. As we think of Napoleon's fall, we might reflect on the image of him on St. Helena, a solitary figure, once the master of Europe, now watching sunsets over the endless ocean. It's a scene of quiet contemplation and perhaps a lesson in humility. Even the greatest of men can be brought low by fate, and the world that seemed to revolve around them moves on. Yet in that quiet end there is also a sense of peace. The cannons are silent, and the soldier can rest. Let's softly summarise the fall to reinforce it. Napoleon's invasion of Russia, 1812, ended in a disastrous retreat and the near destruction of his grand army. A new coalition of enemies rose, and despite Napoleon's efforts, he was defeated in the massive Battle of Leipzig, 1813, losing control of Germany. The Allies invaded France, and facing inevitable defeat, Napoleon abdicated in 1814. He was exiled to Elba, an island in the Mediterranean, retaining the title of emperor there. Unwilling to remain in exile, he escaped and returned for the 100 Days in 1815, but met final defeat at Waterloo, June 1815, against the British and Prussians. Napoleon abdicated again and surrendered. This time the British sent him far away to St. Helena in the Atlantic, where he lived out his final years under guard. Napoleon died on May 5, 1821, likely of natural causes, stomach cancer, at age 51 on St. Helena. Later, his remains were returned to France out of respect. Each step in this fall was like a graceful yielding of the day's light to twilight, starting with the fiery drama of Russia's winter, a stern teacher of limits, moving through the gathering coalescence of his foes and ending in the calm night of his life on a faraway island. Our narration has treated these events not as a sudden crash, but as a gentle, inevitable transition. Napoleon's story, for all its drama, can be seen as having a natural rise and fall, much like the life cycle of a star or the turn of the seasons. As we end this section, we can take comfort that we have seen the complete arc of Napoleon's journey, from bright beginnings to a golden zenith and then to a quiet close. In the silence after battle, there is a kind of relief, and now Europe could finally know peace after 2 decades of conflict. For Napoleon himself, perhaps the final years allowed for introspection, a slower pace, and a chance to craft how he wished to be remembered through his memoirs. Now we have arrived at the final part of our narrative. We will softly examine Napoleon's legacy, what remained in the world after Napoleon was gone, and how people remember and evaluate him. This will bring our journey full circle, allowing us to appreciate the lasting impact of the life we've recounted and to gently conclude with a sense of closure and peace. Legacy Napoleon's physical life ended on that remote island, but his presence in history remained very much alive. In the calm after 1821, people across Europe and beyond began to assess what Napoleon's legacy truly was. Even today, more than 2 centuries later, the echoes of Napoleon's influence are all around, in laws, in language, in national boundaries, and in the stories people tell of leadership and ambition. In this concluding section, we will reflect on the legacy of Napoleon Bonaparte, doing so in a balanced and peaceful manner. Rather than judge, we will observe. What did Napoleon leave behind, and how did history remember him? By periodically repeating and summarizing key points, we will reinforce our understanding softly, helping the mind retain what matters as we relax deeper. First and foremost, Napoleon's legacy lives in the institutions and laws he established. Perhaps the crown jewel of those is the Napoleonic Code, which we discussed earlier. This civil code not only transformed France, but also influenced legal systems worldwide. Long after Napoleon's empire was gone, countries in Europe and Latin America modelled their own law codes on Napoleonic principles of clarity, secular authority, and equal treatment under the law. In many places, the end of feudal privileges and the guarantee of property rights can be traced back to reforms spread by Napoleon. Even some basic ideas we take for granted, like the state issuing civil birth, marriage and death certificates rather than churches, or the concept of public education open to talent, have roots in the Napoleonic era. The metric system, too, propelled by Napoleonic administration, became the standard in much of the world. In a simple sense, if you live in a country with a civil law tradition as opposed to common law, chances are that tradition was touched by Napoleon's reforms. Equality before the law, the secular state and the merit-based society were part of Napoleon's lasting contribution. As Napoleon once purportedly said, "My true glory is not the 40 battles I won. Waterloo will erase the memory of those victories, but what nothing will destroy, what will live forever, is my civil code." In that calm assertion there is truth. Laws outlast battles. Secondly, Napoleon left a legacy in the political landscape of Europe. When he came to power, Europe was a patchwork of old monarchies and feudal structures. By the time he was gone, the map had been radically altered. He redrew boundaries, some ephemeral, some lasting. For example, the Holy Roman Empire was abolished during his reign, never to return. In its place, eventually, the modern nation of Germany would emerge, though not until some decades after Napoleon, spurred indirectly by the nationalist sentiments and consolidations he triggered. Similarly, Napoleon's influence in Italy helped stir ideas of Italian unity. He created the Kingdom of Italy in the north and inspired Italian nationalists, although Italy wouldn't unify until 1870. The countries of Belgium and the Netherlands underwent changes that led to their modern shape. Poland, which had been partitioned out of existence, found a champion in Napoleon. He created the Duchy of Warsaw, planting the hope of Polish independence, though The Congress of Vienna reversed that. The Polish national spirit had been fanned. In Spain and Portugal, Napoleon's incursion inadvertently sparked independence movements in their American colonies. As Spain was weakened, its colonies in Latin America saw opportunity to break away, which they did in the 1810s and 1820s. Figures like Simón Bolívar were partly inspired by the ideas of the French Revolution that Napoleon helped spread. So, paradoxically, while Napoleon was often trying to dominate nations, he also spread the seeds of liberalism and nationalism. People he conquered learned the ideas of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity, and many desired those for themselves. After resisting Napoleon, both Germany and Italy experienced growing national unity feelings. The concept of a citizen army and national conscription, which Napoleon utilised, became standard practice in Europe. In a gentle way, we can say Napoleon was a catalyst that accelerated the transformation of Europe from the old order to the modern age. However, Napoleon's legacy is not viewed as entirely positive. It is complex and debated. There are differing perspectives that historians and people have held. Some see Napoleon as a heroic figure, a military genius, a lawgiver, the one who spread the ideals of the French Revolution, ending old feudal injustices wherever he went. They point to the Napoleonic Code, efficient government, religious tolerance, and military brilliance as reasons to admire him. They might call him the architect of modern Europe, or a brilliant son of the Enlightenment who tried to build a better order. On the other hand, others view Napoleon more critically, as a conqueror whose ambition caused immense suffering. Millions of soldiers and civilians died in the Napoleonic Wars, and many regions of Europe were devastated by the fighting. They would note that Napoleon ruled as a dictator, censored dissent, and at times placed his own family members on thrones they had no right to, treating countries like personal possessions. They might call him a tyrant or aggressor who was finally defeated by a coalition seeking to restore peace. Both views have evidence. As one historian put it, Napoleon was a mirror of contradictions, both liberator and oppressor, enlightened and autocratic. It's serene for us to acknowledge that his legacy is mixed. For France specifically, Napoleon's legacy was somewhat rehabilitated over time. After he died, the Bourbon monarchy that returned was eventually replaced by other regimes. By 1840, the French public's nostalgia for Napoleon was strong enough that King Louis-Philippe arranged to bring Napoleon's remains back to Paris, where they were interred with great ceremony at Les Invalides under the famous gilded dome. This was called the Retour des Cendres, Return of the Ashes, and was accompanied by huge crowds and national pride. Napoleon's nephew, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, actually became president of France in 1848 and then Emperor Napoleon III in 1852, explicitly drawing on his uncle's legend for legitimacy. That shows how potent the Napoleonic legend had become. A Bonaparte could reclaim leadership in France by invoking the name. During that mid-19th century period, Napoleon was almost universally revered in France as a national hero. Veterans of his wars were celebrated. The Arc de Triomphe, which Napoleon had begun, was completed in 1836 and inscribed with the names of his victories and generals. The French army adopted many Napoleonic traditions. In essence, he became a symbol of French glory and unity. Across the world, military schools studied Napoleon's campaigns for lessons in strategy and tactics. Even today, officers might reference his battles in their education. Terms like Napoleonic complex for supposed short man aggression arising from the myth that he was very short, and phrases like meeting one's Waterloo, meaning a decisive defeat, entered common language. That he was actually of average height for his time is a fun fact, about 5 feet 7 inches, not unusually short, but British propaganda caricatured him as tiny, creating a legend that persists. We also see Napoleon's legacy in cultural depictions. Countless books, paintings, and movies have been made about him. Authors from Victor Hugo to Leo Tolstoy in War and Peace to present-day writers have been fascinated by his character. His combination of intellect, charisma, and ego makes him a timeless subject. In these creative works, sometimes he is portrayed as a near-superhuman genius, other times as a tragic figure undone by hubris. The fact that he inspired such deep emotions, loyalty and admiration from his troops, fear and hatred from his enemies, means his story contains all the elements of a grand epic. In our quiet contemplation, we see him not as a two-dimensional figure, but as a flawed human being of extraordinary talents and drives. If we gather the strands of Napoleon's legacy, we can summarize gently. Legal and social reforms, spread of the Napoleonic Code and the idea of equality under the law, modernization of state institutions, secular education systems, these continue to benefit societies. Nationalism and statehood indirectly fueled the rise of nationalism, both to oppose him and as a result of his administrative changes, which led to the unification of nations like Germany and Italy later, and independence movements elsewhere. Military legacy revolutionized military organization and tactics, corps system, conscription, fast maneuver warfare. The modern way of war in the 19th century was largely Napoleonic. Future generals studied him, sometimes to emulate, sometimes to avoid his mistakes. Cultural memory became a legend and cautionary tale, represented the height of France's historical influence. So in France, his memory is often honoured, streets named after him, his statues, etc., while in other countries his invasions are remembered with more ambivalence or negativity. Historical debate. Historians still debate if he was a child of the revolution, spreading its ideals, or a betrayer of the revolution who made himself a new monarch. The truth has shades. He both cemented some revolutionary changes and curtailed some freedoms. Inspiration? He showed that a person of common birth could rise to the top through ability, fulfilling the revolution's promise of careers open to talent. This inspired people worldwide to believe in the possibilities of social mobility and strong leadership guiding a country out of turmoil. In the simplest terms, Napoleon's legacy is that of a transformative figure. He once said, "Greatness is nothing unless it is lasting." In his case, many of his great deeds did last in one form or another. And even the negative aspects, like the cautionary lessons about overreaching ambition, lasted as warnings in the political consciousness of Europe. After his fall, the major powers formed the Concert of Europe, an early diplomatic effort to maintain balance and prevent another single power from dominating as he did. Europe enjoyed a relative peace from 1815 to 1853, in part due to the memory of the Napoleonic Wars, urging caution among statesmen. Now we arrive at the end of our narrative. We have journeyed through Napoleon's life, from the serene shores of Corsica through the battlefields of Europe to the quiet exile in the Atlantic, and finally into the pages of history. Napoleon Bonaparte, history's boldest empire builder, left a mark that cannot be erased. For good or ill, France, Europe, and the world were changed by his 2-decade reign on the public stage. As we close, we can form a peaceful image, perhaps visualize Napoleon's tomb at Les Invalides in Paris, a grand sarcophagus under a dome, sunlight filtering through, where many come to pay respects. Inscribed around it are words listing his achievements. Visitors walk slowly, speaking in hushed tones. It's a place of reflection. In the stillness of our own reflection, we understand that Napoleon's story is not just about battles or laws, but about the arc of human possibility, how one person can rise so high, accomplish so much, and yet also face the limits of power and mortality. It reminds us of the cycles of history, the rise and fall of fortunes, much like day follows night and spring follows winter. With that understanding, we prepare to conclude our calm exploration. We have covered a lot of ground, and you may let the details gently settle in your mind, knowing you can always revisit them. The key ideas: Napoleon's extraordinary rise, his sweeping reforms, his dramatic fall, and his lasting legacy will remain softly illuminated like stars in the quiet sky of memory. Now, as we end, allow yourself to let go of any remaining wakeful thoughts. The story of Napoleon, with all its rich tapestry, can now recede into a soft background hum, lulling you into rest. Feel the comfort of your position, the rhythm of your breathing, and the knowledge that you have journeyed through an epic tale in a peaceful way. Thank you for listening to this story of Napoleon, history's boldest empire. May the lessons of history bring you perspective and tranquility. It's time now to embrace the quiet night that has fallen at the end of our tale. Close your eyes if you haven't already, and drift easily into the embrace of sleep. We bid you a gentle farewell, sweet dreams, and good night.